Darn it, Richard Nixon. Even in a lecture that is all about the lack of you still find a way to crash it. And admittedly, it's kind of my fault because we mentioned that one of the accomplishments of the Nixon administration is the fact that you see some advances in the environmentalism movement. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that just briefly, but also where the roots of that movement come from. Roots, that environment. In the early 1960s, you have a marine biologist by the name of Rachel Carson who publishes a book called Silent Spring. Carson in Silent Spring is to environmentalism what Betty Friedan and the feminine mystique is to the second wave of feminism. Basically, Silent Spring, in this pre-global warming environmentalist movement, is all about the negative effect of humans on the environment, and specifically in the use of pesticides. And actually, there's a particular type of pesticide that is heavily scrutinized, and it's called DDT. Basically, it leads to a whole host of different sort of side effects and negative environmental impacts. And apparently, chemical companies and big farmers tried to do whatever they could to suppress Silent Spring and some of Carson's findings. But as it happens, the book is very, very influential, and it's one of the things that leads to the creation of the Environmental Protection Agency in 1970 and the passage of the Clean Air Act in Congress in that same year. So it's one of those things that's kind of almost similar to again, all those progressive reforms in the early 20th century with Upton Sinclair in the jungle, with John Muir and the conservation movement / preservation movement. It's almost like we have kind of like a continuation of that almost 70 years after the fact. And it makes, look, Rachel Carson in Silent Spring has made Teddy Roosevelt smile. So that being said, that's kind of the last bit of unfinished business left by the Nixon administration. So let's go ahead and move on. Say bye-bye, Teddy. Anyway, there's one other thing that we need to talk about. It has nothing really to do with the Carter administration. This is just kind of like the place where this talk is going to live. And that is this fascinating period in American legal history that we call the Warren Court. And in case you don't know, we've already talked about the Warren Court and that little case called Brown versus Board of Education, the thing that overturns the constitutional defense of Jim Crow. So practically his very first decision becomes the most important decision in American history, at least in the 20th century. And arguably, you don't really have decisions that are as significant as Brown versus Board, but pretty close, and we should go over them. So I'm not necessarily going to go into too much detail on all of these, but you should be familiar with most of these. Again, some of these decisions are just decisions that we take for granted. Or they're decisions where if you stop and think about it, if you think about how life actually works today, you're going to go, oh yeah, of course that's a Supreme Court case. But remember that in general, the Warren Court is a court that is similar to the Marshall Court. It's this period in Supreme Court history where the Supreme Court kind of views itself as advancing certain policies and beliefs. Though in the Marshall Court, remember, it's all about advancing the power of the federal government, the market revolution, and the Warren Court is much more interested in advancing social causes and generally progressive causes. And we see that in the Brown versus Board decision. So some other decisions here include the Engel versus Vitale case. Eventually, you're going to hear that person who will tell you that schools don't allow prayer. And I guess technically that's true, but there's a disclaimer that we have to, or let's say a descriptor that we have to put in there, that it doesn't allow school-led prayer. You can pray. The issue comes down to whether or not schools are seen as endorsing that prayer. And if that is the case, then what Engel versus Vitale tells us is that that is a violation of the Establishment Clause, because that is seen as a school endorsing an establishment of religion. And in the Engel Engel versus Vitale case, it's a court case that revolves around a school that would recite a prayer over the PA system, and this was ruled as unconstitutional. Now, nowadays, you've had a number of these types of cases, including like can prayer be recited at extracurricular events? Technically, no, because again, that is seen as a school-endorsed activity. But nowadays, you get into questions like, at what point is like a nativity scene seen as like I said, a school-sponsored nativity scene? Is that an establishment of religion? And that's where things get a little fuzzy. But you do see, some pushback over, I would kind of say, expressions of Christian belief that many people just kind of took for granted. That was kind of a normal part of their life. And by the way, if you want to know where, some of the Christians that are becoming more politically aware and expressive come from, partially it's because of decisions like Engel versus Vitale. So we also have a lot of court cases that revolve around criminal procedure and the law of arrest. And also, what you do with criminal defendants who are formally charged with a crime. There are two cases here that I think we just kind of link together. Again, these are cases that, it's just kind of a part of our natural perceptions about the justice system. So Gideon versus Wainwright and Miranda versus Arizona. Gideon versus Wainwright. If you have a criminal defendant, they are supposed to be provided with an attorney, even if they can't afford one. Doesn't matter if it's a state crime or a federal crime. Miranda versus Arizona, and given the number of instances we've talked about the police and protests and all that, Miranda is an important case. The Miranda case basically stipulates that prisoners or people who are arrested must be advised of their legal rights before being questioned by the police. And this is, this also informs criminal defendants that they don't have to talk to police. Or if they do, they can wait for an attorney to be present. And they're supposed to inform criminal defendants that they can get a government-appointed attorney. In other respects, though, a lot of the cases revolve around the right to privacy and what the right to privacy actually means. We have the Griswold versus Connecticut case, which establishes that there is a right to privacy in the Due Process Clause. And that also guarantees the right to an abortion. And remember that, a right to birth control. There's a Freudian slip there, and I'll explain where that Freudian slip comes from. But remember that when we talk about a right to privacy in the Constitution, we're not talking about the right to not have your mail or email or text messages read by the federal government. We're talking about a right to bodily autonomy. And so once you establish the Griswold case, or the precedent set in Griswold, it's not that much of a leap to see the court's reasoning in Roe versus Wade, that you apply the right to privacy not just to birth control, but to an abortion. Again, this is one of those cases that also motivates this pushback from the religious right in the United States. You don't have to worry too terribly much about New York Times versus Sullivan or U.S. versus Nixon, especially since we've already talked about U.S. versus Nixon. But we also have some cases that are designed to sort of roll back some of the vestiges of discrimination. One of those cases is hopefully familiar to you guys, Loving versus Virginia. It's a court case that revolves around an ancient institution in U.S. history, and that is that even though you have the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the 14th Amendment, many states, in this case Virginia, still had anti-miscegenation laws. In other words, laws that prohibited people from different races from marrying. So in Loving versus Virginia, the Supreme Court strikes down some of these racial restrictions on interracial marriage. And remember that these are laws that go all the way back to some of the first slave codes passed back in the colonial days. But we also have to, again, point out that this is one of those court cases that involve plaintiffs who were carefully selected. This was a husband and wife. The husband was white, the wife was black, who were extremely sympathetic. And I mean, they even have the last name Loving. You can't do better than that. But the Loving case is the end of something old. At the same time, in another case, in the Regents University of California versus Bakke case, we just remember as the Bakke case, you see the establishment of something new. The Bakke case authorizes colleges the right to establish affirmative action policies to cure past instances of discrimination. It allows colleges to use race as a factor in college admissions. So again, with the Warren Court, and I mean, eventually, by the way, Warren is replaced as Chief Justice after he passes away by Warren Burger. But Warren Burger also kind of continues this process of using the court's power to advance progressive policies. And even today, I mean, even if you're not looking at Roe versus Wade, opinion on the Warren Court is kind of mixed because on the one hand, and to be honest, it kind of depends upon your view of the Supreme Court and what it is there to do. There's the view that the Supreme Court is basically supposed to be the nation's umpires. They just call the balls as they see it. And you actually have a number of justices on the Supreme Court that articulate that point of view. For example, Antonin Scalia. But if you believe that the Supreme Court is supposed to pick up the slack when the other branches of government are unwilling or unable to get things done, then the Warren Court and its successor, the Burger Court, is a time period of great success in American politics. But to many of the conservatives who are sort of forming alliances and groups in the 1970s and 1980s, the Warren Court and the Burger Court are courts that are too activist. They're going beyond what they expect the Supreme Court to do. They're actively defying precedents, and the common criticism is that it seems like their reinterpretations are so broad that they might as well be drafting law rather than interpreting law. Again, everything we talk about with the Supreme Court is very, very fuzzy. But what we can say, though, is that because of all the changes that are brought about by the Warren Court and the Burger Court, suddenly conservatives become very, very focused on who's on the Supreme Court and who isn't. So recently, as probably many of you are aware, the Senate majority, now minority leader, Mitch McConnell, has kind of developed the reputation for being monomaniacally focused on appointing conservative, Republican-leaning justices on the Supreme Court. And arguably, one reason for that is past experiences during the 1960s and 1970s, where it seems like the court is almost like a third legislature. So in the 1980s, 1990s, and up into today, the court has either been more moderate to much, much more conservative. And so that is maybe the other unanticipated legacy of the Warren Court and the Burger Court. It leads to a conservative movement that is much more focused on who's on the court and who's not.